Good morning, church. Isn't it great that when we come in his presence, things can change? That just a moment in the presence of God can literally change everything. We can't help but be the same. We can't stay the same when we're in his presence. Isn't that good news this morning? Isn't it good to worship together? Can we give it up for our worship team leading us today? You can have a seat. My name is Brandon Davis. A little bit about me. I have an incredible family. I have my wife, Mode. She's the most intentional, loving, and life-giving person I've ever met. And we've also been blessed with our incredible daughter, Adela. She is 10 months old. I know I'm biased, but she is the cutest kid you'll ever see. I kind of feel like it's a fact at this point, but we're so blessed by her, and we're so grateful for God just blessing us with such an amazing little girl. And I also have the privilege of being the kids pastor here. And it is an honor to be the kids pastor because investing in the next generation really is a privilege to be able to do that. And there's a verse and I don't have to do it alone. We have a verse to our kids team. I have a team of people that show up Sunday after Sunday ready to invest into your family. And you see several in the room this morning. They got their kids t-shirt on. I'm so great. Can we give it up for our kids team real quick? We're grateful for you. And one verse that has been central to our kids team, and you see it if they got a sweater on when it was in the wintertime. A little too hot now. But Psalm 78 verse 4 is a verse that's been central to our kids team. And it says this: "We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done." That's what our kids team does every week. And they're ready to share the gospel Sunday after Sunday. And I'm so grateful for each and every one of them. And before I share the story today, before I get in God's word, I have a question. Do we have any people watchers in the room? You don't need to be ashamed about it. Come on now. We're all people. Do we have any people watchers in the room? The people watcher is a person that goes to the store, they go to the park for an activity, but the activity and the shopping is only part of the fun. No, you're there to watch people. No, you're there to watch people. You're going to eavesdrop a little bit, kind of figure out what's going on. You're a people watcher. There's no shame in it. I'm a people watcher. But do I have any skilled people watchers in the room? Because there is a distance. I'm a mediocre people watcher. I can't say I'm a skilled people watcher. My wife, on the other hand, man, she is a skilled, highly skilled people watcher. We could be out in public having dinner or at a park, and we could be fully engaging in a great conversation. She's not just listening, she's talking back, she's engaged, she's in it. But at the very same time, she's looking at what's going on in the room. She knows who's in the room, she knows who's coming in, who's going out. She knows what's happening in that family's life, that they're going through. She knows it all, and if you've met my daughter, you know she does this too. She takes up after her mom on this. I'm not a skilled people watcher, but Adela, she's a skilled people watcher too. She'll have one of three reactions to you when she's watching you. She'll either look at you and smile. She'll either talk to you to try to get your attention, or my favorite is she'll give you the biggest side eye you've ever seen. She will look at you and judge you so hardly, but honestly, it's incredible to watch. But here's what I've learned about skilled people watchers. Not only do they know what's going on in the room, they know who's in the room. And knowing who's in the room does have the power to change things. Did you know that? That depending on who's in the room, it has the power to change everything. Imagine you're in a situation where a fight breaks out. And if you're like me, not a skilled people watcher, I'm panicking. I'm like, gotta call 911, but the people watcher would have noticed that there's a cop already in the room. Just walked in. They would have already been aware of it. Or maybe there's a medical emergency and you wanna call 911. Well, the people watcher already noticed the medic. Depending on who's in the room, it has the power to change everything. And the same is true in our walk with God. When God's in the room, he has the power to change everything. The moment he steps in, the moment he's arrived, everything can change. Things can change in a matter of an instant. But in today's story in John chapter 11, we're gonna be sharing about the story of Lazarus. And there was some barriers that caused Martha and Mary and the people surrounding them to doubt what he can do. And if we're not careful, these barriers can cause us to doubt what God can do when he's in the room. And if we're not careful, there's barriers that want to completely sidetrack us from the power that he has. And to give us some context to what's happening, Martha and Mary sent word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus was sick. And that's where we pick up in the story. Y'all ready to read? Yeah. John 11 says this, and it's verses 4 through 10. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short time ago, the Jews there tried to kill you with stones. Are you still going back? And Jesus answered, aren't there 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks during the day won't trip and fall. They can see because of this world's light, but when they walk at night, they will trip and fall. They have no light. And what Jesus is saying in verse 9 and 10, Jesus liked to teach things not always that directly. Did you notice that whenever Jesus teaches things, sometimes the disciples are like, what? What did he say? What do you mean by that? And so what Jesus was referring to in that moment was, in verses 9 to 10, is about his life. It was about his ministry. He's saying, my time has not come yet. I know you're worried about my safety, but I still have time on earth to do what God's called me to do, what the Father has called me to do. My time isn't finished yet. And I don't know who this is for this morning, but I want you to know that God isn't finished yet. That if you have breath in your lungs this morning, God still has a purpose on your life. That there's nothing that's happening in your life to you or been done to you that disqualifies you for his purposes. There isn't anything that God can't redeem. He is the great redeemer. So if you got breath in your lungs, I got good news for you this morning. He's not finished with you yet. And Jesus begins to tell the disciples that our friend Lazarus is sleeping. Another moment where the disciples are confused, like, why are we going to see this man if he's sleeping? And they're like, he'll get up. And so Jesus has to tell them plainly what's going on. And he says this in verse 14 through 20. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your benefit, I'm glad I was not there. Now you will believe. But let us go to him. And verse 17 says, when Jesus arrived, he found out that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to Martha and Mary. They had come to comfort them because their brother was dead. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. And the first barrier that we need to break, if we're going to remember who's in the room, is the barrier of timing. It's a barrier of timing. Here's what Martha says to Jesus when he arrives. He's, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, I wish you would have been here. Then my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you anything you ask for. Timing's a barrier. There are moments in life where God's timing can cause us to doubt if he'll do something. Martha said, I know God will give you anything, but her first response was, you're too late. If you just would have been here a little bit sooner, things would be different. Not could be different. She knew God could heal the sick, but you missed the moment. It's too late. I've had moments where I feel like God's missed the window of opportunity to fix things. Is anybody like me that feel like God's missed the moment to fix it? I have a family member who I'm not able to talk to right now. And I know as a pastor, I'm supposed to get up here and be like, God can do any and everything, and I do believe it, but there are moments where I feel like the window of fixing this relational issue is past. He's missed the moment. And maybe you find yourself in that same situation. Martha was there. She forgot who was standing before her that day. Jesus was standing before her today, but his timing dictated whether or not he could do something. And maybe you find yourself in a marriage that's a little bit rocky. And you're like, God, if you just would have showed up sooner in my marriage, this thing might be better. Or maybe you got a situation like, God, if you just would have been here a little bit sooner, then maybe things would be a little bit better. You missed the window. Or maybe you have a business that you filed for bankruptcy and you're like, God, if you just would have provided a little bit sooner, if you just would have showed up a little bit sooner, things would be different. Timing is a barrier. Yeah. Timing is a big barrier for us. But how many of us know that God's timing is perfect? Yeah. Come on. But it's not only perfect, it's purposeful. Yeah. It's not just, this is just in the nick of time. No, there is purpose in his timing. And I got to believe in the story of Lazarus that there's some purpose in God's timing. Because in verse 5, Jesus says something that I'm like scratching my head about every time I read it. And it's this. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So he loved them. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. He stayed where he was 2 more days. When I get the phone call that someone that I love is sick, when I get off the phone, I'm not doing this. I'm gonna give it 48 hours. I'm just gonna stay where I'm at and hope for the best. No, I'm gonna go to him. I'm gonna do everything in my power to be there for them. And I don't know who needs to hear this morning, but just because he's waiting, it doesn't mean he doesn't love you. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. It doesn't mean he's not gonna show up. He said he loved Martha, so he stayed where he was 2 more days. He loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, so he waited. There's purpose in the waiting. So what is the purpose for the waiting? Verse 4 gives us some insight to why he's waiting, and it says this. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." It is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. I would argue that the purpose for your waiting is to bring him glory. And here's what I've learned whenever it's for his glory. It's ultimately going to be for my good. Anything that has to do with God's glory and God getting the glory is going to be for your good. Did you know that if God's getting the glory, it's going to be for our good? So the thing that you're waiting on, the purpose could be to bring him glory. The thing that you've been praying for years and decades now, the thing that maybe no one knows about, is to bring him glory. Imagine how your faith may increase the moment that you see him move in that situation. There's power in the waiting, and there's purpose in the waiting. Our God is not delayed. No, he's purposeful with his timing. And it says this in verse 23. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he'll rise again. This will happen when people are raised from the dead on the last day." Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even if they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Do you believe this? If we're going to overcome doubt, we have to break the barrier of limitations. The second barrier we have to break is one of limitation. See, Martha would have been aware of some of the things that Jesus has done, right? Up in this point, this is moments before Jesus is going to be going into Jerusalem. He's going to the cross moments later in this chapter, in the book. And you'll see that, yes, she knew he did powerful things. She knew that he healed people. She knew that maybe he's done signs and wonders. But raising someone from the dead, that wasn't something she was aware of. That's not something that could be done. And her response tells me that, I know he'll rise again in the last days. At the end of times, that's when he'll rise again. I believe that Jesus shows that she put a limitation on what he can do. And there's moments in our lives where we put limitations on what God can do. There are moments where we try to push him into a box. Just like timing. Oh, you missed the window. That's a limitation. Maybe you have an addiction and you're like, well, this just cannot be broken. I've dealt with it before. That's a limitation. There's limitations that we put on him. But it says this in Ephesians 3:20, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." And if we really believe we serve a God who can do immeasurably more, why do we put him in a box? If we're not careful, the barrier of timing can dictate whether he can do something. And the barrier of limitations can also dictate what he can do. And if we're going to overcome these barriers, we got to break them. We got to push through them. And here's where you're at. You might be like, well, Brandon, I don't put God in a box. I'm just so much more spiritual than that. I believe he can do anything. And I think at face value, we all think that God can do everything. How many would raise your hand and say, yeah, God is the God of the universe. He can do everything. Yeah, we all believe it. But I want to help you identify, I would propose that there are some areas where we've limited him, whether you know it or not. And to help you identify those places, just ask yourself, where are the places you stopped praying for? What are the areas of your life that you've given up on praying for? I'm sure we could jot down a few, each of us. I know I have some where I've been like, I've been praying at this for a while now. That's a limitation. Maybe you have a family dynamic, a family that is broken. Maybe there's something going on. And when it first happened, you were on your knees and you were believing God to move. But time has passed and now you find yourself saying, this is just the way it'll always be. This is just how it's always been. That's a limitation. Or maybe you have an addiction problem and you're like, you get saved and you're like, Jesus is gonna help me be free of this. It's gonna be amazing. You're high on life. You're high on the Spirit of God, but then things happen and you're still dealing with that addiction. You might just start saying, well, this is just the thorn in my side that Paul talked about. Paul had one, so I get one too. But God said, no, that's a limitation that we're putting on him. That's a limitation. Or maybe yours is this one. This is just too small. I want you to know that that's a limitation too. Saying that this is just too small for God to care about. Why would the God of the universe care about this little feeling that I'm having? Why would the God of the universe care about this little conflict that I'm dealing with? I don't know if you know this. The God, he's a God of the big things, but he's also God of the small things. It says this in Matthew 10, verse 30. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. He cares about the small things. Yes, the big, but he's also in the small things too. Yeah. And if Philippians tells us to pray in chapter 4, verse 6, to pray about everything, the places we've stopped praying about everything is the very place that we put a limitation on God. And Jesus says something to Martha at the end of that verse. He says, do you believe this? When he says, I'm the resurrection and the life, do you believe this? And I believe Jesus is asking us that question this morning. Do you believe that he's the resurrection and the life? Do you believe that he can help you break free from that addiction? Do you believe that he can restore your marriage? Do you believe that he's in the small things? He's not just in the big, but he's also in the small. Do you believe it? Do you believe it, church? Yeah. Do you believe that he's a God who can heal? Do you believe that he's a God who can deliver? Do you believe it? If we're gonna overcome doubt, we have to break the barrier of limitations. And Martha says, I believe it. I believe that you're the Messiah. I believe that you're the Son of God. And she sends word to Mary. And here's what happens in verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Even Mary thought he missed the window. Even Mary, it didn't even say they talked. There's no indication that Martha and Mary talked, but they both had this same feeling that, God, if you just would have been here, things would be different. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And verse 35 says this, Jesus wept. How often do we just skip over verse 35? Anybody grow up in like a Baptist church? Or maybe you're in anybody from Awanas? Any Awana folk out there? I did Awanas. It was amazing. But I remember being in Awanas and the teacher being like, does anybody know the smallest verse in the Bible? And they say, Jesus wept. And we're like, oh, wow, that's amazing. But we leave it there. But if we would take a step back and think about it for a minute, the God in the flesh, who had all power and authority, wept. Think about that for a moment. Jesus knew what he was about to go do. It could have been real easy for Jesus to be low-key excited about what was going to happen. He was about to change their world. He's about to flip their world upside down. But instead, it said that Jesus was deeply troubled, so he wept. That tells me that we serve a God who isn't distant in our pain, who isn't absent in our sorrow. He isn't absent in our brokenness. He's actually very close in those moments. That's a powerful thing, that Jesus wept. So if you find yourself in pain and in sorrow this morning, know that he's not far off. He's near the brokenhearted and the crushed in spirit. He's near you today. Isn't it good to know that we serve a God who's near? There's a God who's near. Because Psalm 34, verse 18 said, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. That's a good reminder. Because if you think about it, the moments of Jesus knew that the pain was only going to last for a moment for them. And if we get a broader perspective of this, we'll see that even for us, our pain is temporary on earth. And it could be real easy for the Father to be like, hey, just deal with it for now. There's glory at the end. There is a new life. But no, he is broken when we're broken, church. He's a loving Father who's near when you need him to be near. And that's a powerful thing to know, that no matter what you're facing, even though the end time, whenever we go be with him, yeah, everything's gonna be made new. But in the moments of waiting for him to move, in the moments where this world is falling, Jesus is broken with us. It said that Jesus wept. We can't skip over it. John chapter 11, verses 38 through 39 say this. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord said, Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. If we're to overcome doubt, we have to break the barrier of death. If we're gonna overcome doubt, we have to break the barrier of timing. We have to break the barrier of limitations, but we also have to break the barrier of death. If we think about it, at this point, day 4, Lazarus' close family members and the people that were closest to him would have washed his dead body. They would have anointed his body with oil and put spices on it. This is how they prepared their bodies back then. They would have wrapped it in several layers of linen. This wasn't a question of Lazarus just being sick and he'll wake up again. No, Lazarus was dead. There was no hope. There was no hope. This was something that was utterly hopeless. And I would imagine that there are some of you in this room that have walked in today feeling utterly hopeless. That you have some things that you feel like God's missed the window of opportunity. That you have a dream that you know God placed on your heart, but life has happened to you, that you've anointed with oil, you've placed spices on it, and you put it in a tomb and rolled the stone over it. Or maybe you have a calling that God has placed on your heart. Instead of fulfilling that calling, life has you burying the calling. I don't know if you know this, but if God has called you, the world doesn't want you to do it. The enemy doesn't want the believers fulfilling what he's called them to do. So you've buried the calling. Or maybe for you, you do have a marriage that is on the rocks, and it feels hopeless and broken. Or maybe you have a financial burden that you just cannot carry. Maybe you got a bad report from the doctor. Or maybe you have just some broken pieces of your family and it just feels like, what can be done? God's missed the window. It's been like this for years now. It's the way it's always been. And Martha and Mary and all the people around them knew they were in a situation that was hopeless. But how many know that depending on who's in the room, it has the power to change everything? Depending on who's in the room, it can change everything. And Martha and Mary are about to discover that the God of the resurrection and the life was in the room. That the waymaker was about to make a way when it felt like there was no way. So maybe you feel like there is no way, but I want to remind you this morning that the waymaker's in the room. And here's what it says in verse 40. It says this, then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And here's what happens in verse 43. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Because the God of the impossible was in the room, the impossible was made possible. So I want you to know that the God of the impossible is in the room this morning. So the marriage that feels like it's on the rocks, he can breathe life back into. The addiction, it can be broken. The thing that you feel like he's missed the window, he can restore. You have a financial burden. Oh, I want you to know that the great provider is in the room this morning. Oh, you have a bad report from the doctor that seems like this is an impossible thing. The great physician is in the room. But if we're not careful, we'll let the barriers dictate if he'll do something. So we have a choice, church. Are we gonna live this life dealing with so much doubt because we put a limitation? Are we gonna live this Christian life with so much doubt because we think, oh, his timing's off, or this thing is dead and gone, the window of opportunity for me to fulfill my calling is over? I come to remind you that if the waymaker's in the room, he can breathe life back into that dream. If the waymaker's in the room, anything is possible. But here's the cool thing. Not only when he moves is it gonna be for your good ultimately and his glory. Here's what happened after Jesus brought Lazarus back to life. Let's read verse 44 again. It says, the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Let him go. I believe today that Jesus is gonna set someone free. He's saying to you, be let go today. The addiction you're holding, let it go. He's called you out. If you got him, if you have the Spirit of God living on the inside of you, the addiction has no hold over you anymore. And it said, verse 45, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. The miracle isn't just for you. The miracle is to bring him glory. Yes, it's for your good, but it's also an invitation to many to believe in him. Imagine the thing you've been praying for that feels like it's been years and decades. Imagine if he answers it now. The glory he will get. Don't hide your testimony, church, because your testimony could be the very thing that calls someone to get to know him. Did you know that the way that God moves in your life isn't just for you, it can be for others. Many believed. And I believe that God is gonna do something today or this week because the God of the impossible is in the room, that many are gonna come to believe. So don't hide your testimony. Don't hide it. Because when the Waymaker moves, it changes everything. How many of us believe that depending on who's in the room, it can change everything? It can change everything. Here's what I want us to do. Do I have any community group leaders, kids team members that feel like they want to get up here and pray? I would love to have you come down to the front because I believe that we need to be praying for these things. Maybe you do have some limitations. I want to create an opportunity for you to come down and get prayed for. Anybody just feels like they're a prayer warrior, get up here. We'd love to have you up here. So here's what I want us to do. I'm going to take a minute to pray over the service. But as I'm praying, if you feel like, God, I have some limitations, I have an addiction that needs to be broken, I have a marriage that needs to be restored, I believe if we be a people of prayer, we'll see God do something miraculous. So here's what we're gonna do. Every head bowed, every eye's closed. Jesus, we thank you for today. If you feel like you need prayer, come to the front. Jesus, we thank you for today. I thank you, Lord, that the Waymaker's in the room. And when the Waymaker's in the room, anything is possible. God, I pray that you help each and every one of us overcome these barriers that cause us to doubt you. The barrier of timing,